The day of my ex-husband's funeral, my son stood beside the casket with his hands folded, his face calm, almost gentle, and that was the moment I knew something wasn't right. Not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't cry. He didn't bow his head. He didn't reach out to touch the polished wood like the other mourners did. He just stood there, still a stone, staring at his father like he was waiting for something to happen. I remember thinking, maybe this is what forgiveness looks like now? I was wrong. The church smelled like old hymn books and lemon polish, the way all churches do when they're trying too hard to be clean for grief. The pews were packed, former coworkers, distant relatives, neighbors who hadn't spoken to us in years but still came out of obligation. People whispered my name as I passed, their voices soft and careful, like I might shatter if spoken to too loudly. "I'm so sorry for your loss," they kept saying. I nodded. I smiled politely. I thanked them. But the truth was, I didn't know what I was supposed to be grieving. The man in that casket hadn't been my husband for over 20 years. And yet, he had never stopped being my son's father. That was the part no one ever knows how to mourn. My son, Daniel, was 32 that year, tall like his father, same deep-set eyes, same quiet way of watching a room before stepping into it. People used to say he was the spitting image of his dad. Every time someone said that, I felt something tighten in my chest, but I never corrected them. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud to hurt. Daniel had insisted on standing at the front of the church, closest to the casket. When I asked him softly if he wanted to sit with me instead, he shook his head. "I'm fine, Mom," he said. "I want to stand." His voice was steady, too steady, and that should have been my first real clue. Before all of this, before funerals and forgiveness and unspoken truths, our life had been simple, not perfect, but steady. I raised Daniel mostly on my own after his father left. I worked long hours at the county office, came home smelling like copier ink and burnt coffee, cooked dinner while he did homework at the kitchen table. We didn't have much, but we had routines: Sunday breakfasts, Friday night movies, the quiet comfort of knowing who would be there when you got home. His father, Marcus, walked out when Daniel was 9. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a suitcase by the door and a sentence that still echoes in my mind all these years later. "I can't do this anymore." He said it like he was talking about a job he hated, not a family. Daniel stood in the hallway barefoot, clutching his school backpack, watching his father leave without a single tear. I cried enough for both of us that night. Daniel didn't cry at all. For years after, Marcus was a ghost who drifted in and out of our lives. Birthday cards without return addresses, missed visitations, promises he never kept. Every time he showed up, Daniel let him back in. Every time he disappeared, Daniel said nothing. That silence became my son's language. When Daniel turned 18, Marcus stopped calling altogether. No explanation, no goodbye. Just gone. I was angry for a long time, angry at Marcus for leaving, angry at myself for not protecting my son better, angry at the world for making abandonment feel so normal. But Daniel surprised me. He did what he knew how to do, he told me once, years later. Holding on to anger won't change him. I remember looking at my son that day, thinking how much older he sounded than his years. That was when he first said the word forgave. "I forgave him a long time ago, Mom." I wanted to believe him. God knows I did. When we got the call about Marcus's death, it came from a number I didn't recognize. "He passed in his sleep," the woman said. "I'm his sister." I hadn't heard her voice in decades. Daniel was sitting across from me at the table, scrolling on his phone when I told him. He looked up, nodded once, and said, "Okay." Just okay. No questions, no visible reaction. Later that night, I found him standing on the back porch, staring into the dark. "You all right?" I asked. He took a breath. "Yeah, I already made peace with it." That word again, peace. Back at the funeral, the pastor began to speak about Marcus's life, his work ethic, his generosity, his struggles. It was a version of my ex-husband I barely recognized. I wondered how many of these people knew the man who forgot birthdays and missed graduations, how many of them knew the sound of a child waiting by the window for a father who wasn't coming. Daniel listened without expression. Then came the part where family members were invited to say a few words. My heart began to pound. I didn't know why, not yet, but something in my chest felt tight, like a warning I couldn't name. The pastor looked at Daniel. "Would you like to speak?" For the first time that day, my son smiled, just a little. "Yes," he said, "I would." He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. I watched his hands. They were shaking. And in that moment, I understood something I had refused to see for years. Forgiveness isn't always the absence of anger. Sometimes it's just anger that learned how to wait. Daniel looked out at the crowd, then down at his father's casket. People keep telling me how lucky I was to have him. And that's when I knew. Whatever my son was about to say, this funeral was about to expose everything. Daniel's voice carried clearly through the church, calm and steady, but I could hear something underneath it, a tightness, like a rope pulled too far. "People keep telling me how lucky I was to have him," he repeated, glancing briefly at the front row where I sat. Our eyes met for half a second, not long enough for comfort, just long enough for truth. A few people nodded, murmuring softly. Daniel continued, "And I want to start by saying I forgave my father a long time ago." My shoulders relaxed just a little. Around us, the room seemed to exhale. Forgiveness was the word everyone wanted to hear. It wrapped grief up neatly, like a bow on a box no one wanted to open. Daniel paused. "I forgave him," he said again, slower this time, "so I could live my life without carrying his absence everywhere I went." I felt that sentence settle deep in my chest, because it was true. After Marcus left, I did everything I could to make sure Daniel didn't grow up bitter. I didn't speak badly about his father, not out loud anyway. I answered his questions honestly, but gently. I let him hope, even when I knew better. Some nights after Daniel went to bed, I'd sit at the kitchen table, listening to the familiar creaks of the house settling, thinking about Marcus, about all the moments he'd missed, about the boy Daniel had been and the man he'd become. I wondered if forgiveness really erased wounds or just buried them deeper. Back at the funeral, Daniel shifted his weight, resting one hand on the podium. "My father taught me a lot, not always in the ways he probably intended." A few uneasy chuckles moved through the crowd. "He taught me how silence can hurt more than shouting, how promises mean nothing without action, how a child can learn to stop asking for things just to avoid being disappointed." I felt my throat tighten. This wasn't part of any polite funeral script. I glanced at Marcus's sister in the second row. Her smile had stiffened. She leaned toward her husband, whispering something sharp. Daniel didn't notice or didn't care. "But," he said, lifting his eyes again, "he also taught me something else." He took a breath. "How to let go." There it was again, the neat ending everyone wanted. I felt myself relax, embarrassed by my earlier fear. Maybe I'd misread him. Maybe this was his way of closing a chapter. Maybe this funeral really was about peace. Daniel nodded once, stepped back from the microphone, and returned to his place beside the casket. Applause filled the church, soft, respectful. People smiled at me as if to say, "You raised him right." I smiled back. but my hands were cold. After the service, mourners gathered in the church hall for coffee and quiet conversations. The air smelt like cheap pastries and strong tea. People spoke in hushed tones, as if the dead could still hear us. Daniel stayed close to me, accepting condolences politely. "I'm proud of you," I whispered at one point. He gave a small nod. "Thanks, Mom." But there was distance in his eyes, a look I'd seen before, usually when he was holding something in. When we got home later that afternoon, the house felt heavier than usual. The silence pressed in from all sides. I kicked off my shoes and headed to the kitchen, grateful for something ordinary to do. Daniel stood in the doorway watching me fill the kettle. "Are you okay?" I asked again. "I will be," he said. Then after a pause, "I need to show you something, but not yet." I turned to him. "Show me what?" "Soon," he replied. "Just let today pass." There it was again, that same careful control, the sense that he was holding time in his hands. I wanted to push, to ask, to demand, but I didn't, because mothers learn when to wait. That night after Daniel went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creaks of the house settling, thinking about Marcus, about all the moments he'd missed, about the boy Daniel had been and the man he'd become. I wondered if forgiveness really erased wounds or just buried them deeper. The next morning, Daniel left early for work. On the kitchen table, he'd left his funeral program behind. I picked it up absently, smoothing the folded paper. Something slipped out. An envelope, plain, unmarked. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. My heart began to race. I told myself it was none of my business. I unfolded it anyway. At the top, in Daniel's writing, were the words, "What I never said." My hands trembled as I read the first line. And in that moment, I realized the funeral hadn't been the end of anything. It had only been the beginning. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, that single sheet of paper resting in my hands like it might burn me if I held it too tightly. What I never said. The words stared back at me, neat and deliberate, written in the careful handwriting Daniel had always had. Even as a child, his letters were precise, almost restrained, like he was afraid to take up too much space on the page. I read the first paragraph once, then again. "Dad, I don't know where to begin, so I'll start with the part everyone thinks I've finished. Forgiveness." My chest tightened. I should have stopped, folded the letter back up, put it where I found it, but I didn't, because I was his mother, and because something in me already knew this letter held the truth Daniel had been carrying alone. He wrote about the night Marcus left, about standing barefoot in the hallway, the cold tile on his feet, the sound of the front door clicking shut. He wrote about how he waited for hours, sitting on his bed, convinced his father would come back once he cooled off. He never did. Daniel wrote about birthdays where he watched the door instead of the cake, about graduations where he scanned the crowd even though he told himself not to, about how every broken promise taught him to lower his expectations, not just of his father, but of people. "I told myself forgiving you meant forgetting," he wrote, "but it turns out forgiving you just taught me how to survive without you." My vision blurred. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, annoyed at myself for crying now, years too late to change anything. The letter went on, and that's when my stomach dropped. "What I never told anyone," Daniel wrote, "is that you didn't just leave once." My breath caught. "You came back when Mom wasn't home. You told me not to tell her. You said it would only confuse things." My hands began to shake so badly I had to set the paper down. I remembered those years, the afternoons when Daniel would be quiet, distant, retreating into his room without explanation. I'd assumed it was school, hormones, growing pains. I never imagined. You asked me for money, the letter continued, small amounts at first, lunch money, birthday cash. You said you needed help getting back on your feet. The room felt suddenly too small. When I finally said no, you disappeared again. That was the last time I saw you in person. I pushed my chair back hard enough that it scraped loudly across the floor. All those years, all those silences. I'd been angry at Marcus for abandoning us. I hadn't known he'd been quietly draining our son, too. When Daniel came home that evening, I was still sitting at the table. The letter lay folded in front of me, its edges worn soft from my hands. He stopped short when he saw my face. "You found it," he said quietly. "I wasn't looking," I replied. My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "It fell out of the program." He nodded, setting his keys down slowly. I figured. We stood there, facing each other across the table that had held so many ordinary moments, homework, dinners, laughter. It felt wrong for something so heavy to sit between us. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Daniel exhaled, sat down across from me. "Because you already carried enough, because you were angry enough, because I didn't want you to hate him more than you already did." I swallowed hard. "And you?" He looked down at his hands. "I already hated him." The honesty in his voice cut deeper than any accusation. "I thought you forgave him," I said softly. Daniel's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I forgave him," he said, "but forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and it's definitely not the same as pretending nothing happened." I looked at the letter again. "Is this what you meant yesterday when you said you had something to show me?" "Yes." "Why now?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because he's gone," Daniel finally said, "and because people keep rewriting who he was. I couldn't let him leave this world without the truth existing somewhere." My heart sank. "You planned to read this," I realized. "At the funeral," he admitted. "I almost did." "Almost? What stopped you?" Daniel looked up at me then, really looked at me. "You." The word landed heavy between us. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said. "I still don't." Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. "You wouldn't have hurt me. You would have freed me." He shook his head gently. "Maybe, or maybe it would have made you relive things you already survived." That's when I understood something painful and beautiful all at once. My son had been protecting me, even while carrying his own wounds. We sat there until the light outside faded, the kitchen filling with evening shadows. "So why bring it up at all?" I asked finally. "Why leave the letter where I could find it?" He hesitated. "Because forgiveness shouldn't mean silence anymore, and because there's more." My stomach tightened again. "More?" He nodded slowly. "What I said at the podium wasn't everything." I leaned forward. "Daniel, the funeral exposed some things," he said, "but not all of it. There's something else Dad did, something people deserve to know." A chill ran through me. "What kind of something?" He stood up, pacing the length of the kitchen, running hand through his hair the way he always did when he was trying to steady himself. "I didn't expose him yesterday," Daniel said. "I exposed myself, enough to let people believe I'd made peace." He turned back to me, his eyes steady, resolved. "But the truth, though?" "The truth," he said quietly, "isn't done yet." I didn't sleep that night. Daniel's words kept circling my mind like a question I was afraid to answer. The truth isn't done yet. By morning, my head ached from exhaustion, but my heart was wide awake. Daniel sat across from me at breakfast, stirring his coffee without drinking it. The spoon clinked softly against the mug over and over until finally I reached out and placed my hand over his. "Whatever it is," I said, "you don't have to carry it alone anymore." He looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was deciding whether to open a door he'd kept locked for years. "Do you remember when Dad suddenly showed up at my college graduation?" he asked. I nodded slowly. Of course I did. Marcus had appeared late, stood at the back, clapped too loudly. He hugged Daniel afterward, told everyone how proud he was. I remembered thinking, maybe this time he'll stay. He didn't come for me, Daniel said. He came for himself. My chest tightened. What do you mean? Daniel took a deep breath. After the ceremony, he asked me to walk with him, just the two of us. I remembered Daniel coming back late that night, quiet, thoughtful. I'd assumed he was processing adulthood. I thought he wanted to talk about us, Daniel continued, about fixing things. He swallowed. Instead, he asked me to sign something. My heart skipped. Sign what? A loan agreement, Daniel said flatly, in my name. The room seemed to tilt. He said he needed help starting over, said it was temporary, said family helps family. I pressed my fingers into the table, grounding myself. Daniel, you didn't... I didn't sign it. Not then. Relief washed over me too quickly. But, he added, I didn't walk away either. I felt the relief drain out of me. He kept calling after that, Daniel said, kept saying I was the only one he could trust, that you'd never understand, that you'd try to stop me. My mouth went dry. And I believed him, Daniel said quietly, because I wanted to believe there was still something worth saving. I closed my eyes. Marcus had always known where to press. Daniel stood up and went to the hallway closet. He returned with a worn folder, edges bent, corners softened by time. He placed it on the table between us. Inside were papers, bank statements, emails, a copy of a loan application, rejected, with Marcus's name and Daniel's signature scanned at the bottom. I didn't know what I was signing. He told me it was proof of support, not debt. My breath caught. The loan went through, in my name. When he stopped paying, it came after me. I stared at the numbers, the dates, the amount. It felt obscene seeing my son's life reduced to line items and interest rates. I paid it, Daniel said, over years, quietly, while you thought I was saving for a house. A sob tore out of me before I could stop it. Oh, Daniel, why didn't you come to me? He looked at me gently. Because you already gave up everything for me. I couldn't ask for more. I reached across the table and pulled him into my arms, holding him the way I hadn't since he was small. His shoulders shook once, then stilled. That was when I realized how carefully he'd learned to contain his pain. After a while, Daniel pulled back. There's something else, he said. My heart sank. There's always something else, isn't there? He nodded. When Dad got sick, he reached out again. I felt a familiar anger rise in me. Of course he did. He wanted forgiveness, Daniel said. Public forgiveness. The word public echoed in my mind. He said he didn't want to die remembered as a failure. He asked me to say something at the funeral, something good. I remembered the phone call now, Daniel sitting quietly afterward, staring at the wall. So that's why you agreed, I said. Yes, Daniel replied, but not for the reason he thought. I frowned. Then why? Daniel's jaw tightened. Because I realized something. He leaned forward. Dad didn't want forgiveness. He wanted erasure. He wanted all the damage he caused to disappear once he was gone. I felt a chill move through me. And you weren't going to give him that, I said. No, Daniel replied softly. I wasn't. I thought of his speech, of the careful words, the truths tucked between politeness. You exposed him without naming him, Daniel nodded. I wanted people to hear the consequences without turning the day into a spectacle. I let out a shaky breath. That was merciful. Mercy wasn't for him, Daniel said. It was for me. Later that week, the calls started. Marcus's sister, old family friends, people who'd been at the funeral. They wanted to talk. Some of them were confused, others were angry. What did Daniel mean by that speech? He made it sound like Marcus wasn't the man we knew. Why bring up old wounds now? I listened quietly as Daniel fielded the calls, calm but firm. I told the truth, he said again and again, nothing more. But the truth has a way of loosening tongues. Within days, stories surfaced. A cousin mentioned money Marcus borrowed and never returned. A former coworker hinted at lies, schemes, burned bridges. The picture that emerged wasn't kind. It was accurate. And suddenly, the man in the casket no longer looked like a misunderstood saint. He looked like what he'd always been, a man who ran from the damage he caused. One evening, as Daniel and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip low, he turned to me. "There's one last thing," he said. I braced myself. What now? "There's a letter," he said. "Not the one you found. Another one." My pulse quickened. "From who?" "From Dad," Daniel replied. "He gave it to me before he died, told me to read it after the funeral." "And did you?" Daniel nodded. "What did it say?" Daniel's voice was steady when he answered. "He asked me to forgive him and keep his secrets." I felt my hands curl into fists. And I realized something important, Daniel said, looking out into the fading light. "What?" "That forgiveness doesn't mean silence." I didn't ask Daniel to read me his father's letter. Some things need to be offered, not taken, but the weight of it sat between us on that porch, heavier than the evening air. The cicadas hummed in the trees, the same sound I'd listened to on countless summer nights when Daniel was a child, chasing fireflies while I called him in before it got too dark. Back then, darkness was something I thought I could protect him from. I was wrong. "He wanted me to destroy it," Daniel said suddenly. "The letter?" I asked. He nodded. "Said it was just between us. Said it would complicate things if anyone else knew." I let out a bitter breath. Of course he did. Daniel turned to me. He didn't apologize, not really. He explained himself. He justified things. He talked about his fears, his failures, about how life backed him into corners. "That sounds like Marcus," I said quietly. "Always the victim of his own choices." Daniel was silent for a moment. "Do you know what hurt the most?" he asked. I shook my head. "He said I was strong," Daniel replied. "Said he was proud of me for handling things so well, like the damage he caused was some kind of test I passed for him." My chest ached. "He never asked what it cost you," I said. "No," Daniel agreed. "He just assumed I'd pay it." We sat there until the sky deepened into purple, neither of us rushing the moment. Grief, I'd learned, doesn't move on command. It arrives in waves, and sometimes it just sits. "So what are you going to do?" I asked gently. Daniel's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "I'm not going to destroy the letter." I waited. "I'm not going to publish it either. I don't need to humiliate a dead man." Relief washed over me, not because I wanted Marcus protected, but because I knew my son wasn't acting out of bitterness. "I'm going to tell the truth when it matters," Daniel said, "and I'm going to stop pretending forgiveness means pretending nothing happened." I nodded slowly. "That sounds like freedom." He smiled faintly. "It feels like it." The following weeks were quieter, but not peaceful. Marcus's name kept surfacing in conversations, at family gatherings, on phone calls, even at the grocery store. People spoke about him differently now, more carefully, as if the image they'd held had cracked and they were afraid to look too closely at the pieces. Some people avoided us altogether. Others leaned in. One afternoon, Daniel received a call from a man he barely remembered, an old friend of Marcus's. They met at a coffee shop downtown. Daniel asked me to come with him. "I don't want to do this alone," he said. We sat across from the man, steam rising from untouched mugs. He looked nervous, hands clasped tight. "I should have said something years ago," the man began, "but it didn't feel like my place." Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened. The man went on to describe how Marcus had borrowed money, promised repayment, vanished, how he'd manipulated sympathy, used guilt like currency. "I thought it was just me," the man admitted, "but after the funeral, after what you said, I realized there were others." Daniel nodded slowly. There were. By the time we left, Daniel's shoulders looked lighter, like naming the truth had loosened something knotted inside him. Not everyone was understanding. Marcus's sister called one evening, her voice sharp. "You embarrassed him," she said. "That speech? People are talking." Daniel stayed calm. "I told the truth." "You could have waited," she snapped. "He's dead." "That's exactly why it mattered," Daniel replied. "He doesn't get to rewrite his story now." She hung up on him. Daniel stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it down. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "I am. I don't need her approval." I felt a swell of pride then, quiet, steady. This was what growth looked like. Not loud, not dramatic, just firm. One evening, weeks later, Daniel came home carrying a small box. "I paid it off," he said simply, setting it on the table. I looked inside. Old documents, loan papers, receipts. "The last of it," he added. "Every cent." My throat tightened. "Daniel," he said gently. "I know. You're going to say you wish you could have helped." I nodded. He smiled softly. "You already did. You raised me to finish what I start." He paused. "But I'm done carrying it now." That night, he shredded the papers one by one. The sound of tearing paper filled the room, rhythmic and final. When he finished, he took a deep breath. "It's over," he said. I believed him. Months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Daniel asked me something unexpected. "Would you come with me?" he said. "Where?" "The cemetery." My heart skipped. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I don't want to talk to him. I just want to stand there and leave without saying anything." So we went. The headstone was simple, Marcus's name etched cleanly, no grand words, no excuses. Daniel stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, breathing slow and even. Then he turned away. "That's it," he said. As we walked back to the car, I realized something profound. This wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about release. The world didn't change all at once. It changed in small ways, quiet ones that didn't make noise but shifted weight. People stopped speaking about Marcus like a misunderstood hero. His name came up less at gatherings, and when it did, there was a pause first, a hesitation, as if everyone was finally deciding which version of him they were allowed to believe. Daniel noticed it too. "Funny how truth doesn't shout," he said one evening as we folded laundry together. "It just waits until people are ready to hear it." I nodded. "And when they are, they hear more than you ever said." The biggest consequence didn't come from gossip or judgment. It came from responsibility. A lawyer contacted Daniel about outstanding debts Marcus had left behind, things Daniel wasn't legally obligated to cover, but that had been quietly assumed would be handled by family. Daniel listened, asked questions, took notes. Then he said something that felt like the final step in a long journey. "I'm not taking this on." There was silence on the other end of the line. "That debt belongs to him, not me, not my mother." When he hung up, his hands were steady. For the first time, I realized how much of Daniel's life had been shaped by taking on weight that wasn't his, and how powerful it was to see him set it down. A few weeks later, Daniel was asked, politely but pointedly, not to attend a family gathering on Marcus's side. He said it would be uncomfortable, he told me, shrugging. I felt anger flare in my chest. Uncomfortable for who? For people who preferred the old story, Daniel replied. Not's okay. You're not angry? I was, but I'm not anymore. And he meant it. That was the strange thing about watching my son heal. There was no big moment, no dramatic speech, just choices, boundaries, peace that didn't ask permission. Life settled into a new rhythm. Daniel started looking at houses again, not with urgency, just curiosity. On Saturdays, we walked the neighborhood, pointing out porches and gardens. I want something with light, he said once. Big windows, no shadows. I smiled, understanding more than he realized. At work, he took on a leadership role he'd always avoided. For years, he'd stayed small, cautious. Now he spoke up, made decisions, trusted himself. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, he said something that caught me off guard. I think I want to start therapy. I set my fork down slowly. That sounds like a good idea. He nodded. I don't want to carry things so quietly anymore. My eyes burned, not with sadness, but pride. As for me, healing came differently. I'd spent so many years protecting Daniel from the truth that I'd forgotten to protect myself. After everything came out, I found myself revisiting old memories, not with anger, but clarity. I let myself grieve the marriage I thought I had, the man I hoped Marcus would become, the years I spent making excuses for him even in my own mind. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since Daniel was a child, journals at first, then letters I never sent. One of them was to Marcus. I didn't forgive him in that letter. I thanked him for leaving, because staying would have taught Daniel something far worse. I never mailed it. I didn't need to. One afternoon, months after the funeral, Daniel came home smiling. I got the house, he said. I laughed, tears spilling over as I hugged him. I knew you would. As we stood there, I felt something settle inside me, a peace that didn't feel fragile or borrowed. Later, while helping him unpack, I noticed something on the shelf. The letter, the one from Marcus. You kept it, I said gently. Daniel nodded. Not for him. For you? For me, he corrected, so I remember what silence costs. He placed it in a drawer and closed it carefully. Not hidden, just contained. The following spring, Daniel invited a few close friends over for dinner at his new place. Nothing fancy, just good food, laughter, warmth. At one point, someone asked about his father. Daniel didn't tense, didn't deflect. He simply said, "He taught me what kind of man I don't want to be." And that was all. No bitterness, no apology, just truth. I watched my son from across the room, surrounded by people who knew him, not a story, not a role, but the man he chose to become. And I thought about that day in the church, about how I'd mistaken calm for peace. Now I knew better. Peace doesn't come from pretending wounds don't exist. It comes from finally letting them breathe. Later that night, as we washed dishes side by side, Daniel spoke softly. "Thank you for letting me find my own way," he said. I looked at him. "You were never lost." He smiled, and for the first time in a very long time, I believed it too. Life doesn't always give us loud endings. Sometimes it gives us quiet ones. In the months after everything settled, I found myself thinking less about Marcus and more about the version of myself I used to be, the woman who believed keeping the peace meant keeping silent. I didn't judge her anymore. I understood her. She did what she thought love required at the time. But love, I learned, isn't about covering wounds. It's about letting them heal in the open. Watching my son step into his own truth taught me that forgiveness isn't a gift you give to someone else. It's a boundary you give yourself. And boundaries don't erase the past. They keep it from stealing your future. Daniel didn't forgive his father to protect his memory. He forgave him to free his own life. And I think that's the part people misunderstand most. You can forgive and still tell the truth. You can heal and still remember. You can move forward without pretending it hurt. Today, when I look at my son, I don't see the boy who waited by the door anymore. I see a man who chose honesty over silence, peace over performance, and strength over denial. And I see myself differently too. Not as a woman who failed to protect her child, but as a mother who raised one strong enough to break a cycle. So now I want to ask you something from the heart. If you were standing where my son stood, would you have stayed silent for the sake of peace, or would you have let the truth be heard, even if it made people uncomfortable? Did this story move you? Did it make you think about your own family, your own boundaries, your own healing? If it did, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for taking the time to listen and for supporting stories like this. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe. It truly helps these stories reach others who may need them. Until next time, take care of your heart and don't be afraid to tell your truth.